Let me just, it's on page 2 under number 3 of the yellow handout. It's just a matter of definitions. And then I think I'm just sort of thinking out loud what maybe we'll finish up with is the struggle for recognition stuff. Okay, so the embedded self idea, that's the communitarian idea. It's an, in fact, I have a slide about it now that I remember. Let me flip through here. You know, you plan something and you throw everything together and you're like, well, we're not going to be able to talk about any of that stuff. I thought, yeah. So what we're talking about here is both a normative and an ontological question with regard to the self. Okay? So the embedded self idea, this is the communitarian idea that says to be a self is to be a bearer of culture, to be embedded within a culture. Right? To be who you are is to be thick with cultural identity. This is how Taylor puts it. Thick identities, the claim of the thickness of the self deep in culture. Very interesting story in the history of philosophy about this. I mean, it's not like these communitarians just made this up. You know, they're inheriting a bunch of deep insight here. One of these has traced back through Wittgenstein and the problem of private language. So, you know, could you have your own language? All by yourself. When you start thinking about what it means to have a language, it's probably not so obvious that you could have your own language, right? Instead, what happens is personal identity, on this story, the embedded self story, personal identity gets fleshed out through language, through culture, and in fact, you can go back to Hegel for this, that to think is to be in a world that's already full of culture and significance and meaning. So the embedded self idea says ontologically, you can't just wake up one day and say, I am me. It wouldn't happen, right? Instead, you find yourself, this is the existentialist, you find yourself thrown into a cultural situation. Now you are who you are, and you didn't even choose it, right? I mean, that's true. I think they're right about this. You did not choose who you are. Your gender, your race, your language, or whatever. You discovered that you had it, right? Which then leads to a normative claim about the embedded self, is that you simply should not force. Let me start my sentence over. A normative claim. We shouldn't try to turn embedded selves into something they are not, right? We can't say to people, now you're free to choose, because you're not, right? So the ontology of the self tells us what we can do with regard to the norms of both ethics and politics. Okay, the opposite view, the unencumbered self view. This, okay. This is the language of. I put the embedded with communitarian. Yeah. And the maybe that wasn't right. Oh, unencumbered right up top. Put the unencumbered with the liberal individualism. Awesome. The unencumbered self. This phrase actually comes from Michael Sandel, who uses it as an accusation. Oh, you with your unencumbered self idea, like as if it's bad to have an unencumbered self idea. So, yeah, and Michael Sandel, yeah, it sounds so light. I'm unencumbered, you know, I'm free, right? So the liberal tradition, especially through its Kantian iterations, wants to say that we are radically free to choose who we are and who we want to be. You heard me say Hegel with regard to the encumbered self, the embedded self, and you heard me say Kant with regard to the unencumbered self. Well, there's a deep divide in the history of social philosophy that comes through the difference between Kant and Hegel. Do you mind a brief history lesson about this? Okay, so Kant comes along. You've heard of Kant? K-A-N-T. The German philosopher. In England, I guess they say can't. So anyway, Kant suggests that there's a kind of freedom that we have as transcendental selves, that he's trying to understand what it is to be a self. And he basically has a story of you that wants to abstract you from everything that you are, except for the categories of thinking themselves, right? So to be a self is to be a thinking thing. Ha! That sounds like Descartes. Now you're getting a big philosophy history lesson. To be a self is to be a thinking thing, with the categories of thought in place but nothing else. Okay? Hegel is the next generation after Kant, and Hegel says that's ridiculous. you can't think, even if you have supposedly have these categories of thought, you can't think without content to be thought, right? So Hegel says, no, we have to then put the thinking self back into the world that it inherits. So Hegel takes history very seriously. He takes culture very seriously, and so on. So fast forward then back to where we are today with regard to this multicultural milieu that we're in. The assimilationist model wants to say that free selves, unencumbered or let me make it a little bit stronger. Embedded selves should unencumber themselves. Right? It sounds like a cummerbund. I'm picturing like you take your belt of culture off. You take it off. Or maybe it's a weight belt weighting you down. You take the weight belt off and now you can float freely and then land where you will as butterflies flitting through the, use your favorite metaphor there. So the assimilationist, the liberal tradition wants us to be free to choose, right? The communitarian view says that is just both ontologically false and normatively rude to tell people that they should take their belts off or whatever. The multicultural view that Kimlich is talking about, again, is trying to sort of find itself in the middle, where there is some freedom to choose, some recognition for the encumbrances of culture, right? And we're kind of stuck in the middle of all this. Okay. It's Friday afternoon, after all. Are you guys having fun? Yes, please do.
To me, then, most of us here are involved in the liberal arts, right? We're teaching in order to liberate students, but that, in these terms, it sounds a little colonial, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, ultimately, what I'm trying to get at, how is this going to affect my teaching, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're working on. So, are we really working to liberate our students from baggage that they have, or preconceptions they have?
Liberate them to be butterflies to land where they will.
But that's clearly ridiculous, right? Or is it
Well, you pick your poison on this, right? So, and that's actually, I think it does inform your pedagogy. So and all I can do is confess myself on this, right? So I'm a humanist. I'm really kind of liberal. I'm more on the freedom and choice side than on the deep cultural affinity side, but that may be because I'm a white male. Okay, so anyway, but I think what I want my students to do is get to the point where they can be as free as possible. No, I don't think there's radical freedom. I mean, they will never learn, I will never learn to speak Chinese. It ain't going to happen, right? So I already have limits in terms of what I could choose. But I can still choose a whole lot, I think. So I want my students to come to the point where they can make choices with regard to their own culture, right? Even yes or no with regard to their own culture, because I have a different view also, which is that cultures themselves are always in the process of reevaluation and reassessment. So as a player within a culture, you still have questions about that culture. And I think I just help students maybe do that a little bit better.
But you bring up that part of your own perspective is coming from your own culture, and so maybe it would be a product of the fact that you're a white male. Is there, how much are we going to be able to engage in this? The thing that to me sticks out that is necessary for students to be able to engage with their education and engage with the professors is having professors that they can relate with, that have similar life experience or have similar cultures where they're coming from. I always feel a little weird in the classroom talking about the issues that African Americans have faced in this classroom. Hey, I'm a white guy, and here's the struggle that a lot of you guys have went through. It seems to me that the only the most impactful fix is the one that we're always kind of back away from. We need more black professors. We need more East Asian professors. We need that. That's right. All this to me seems kind of like window dressing on top of really at the core level. There are some of us that we all have different cultural backgrounds, and as long as the majority of the faculty are white males or just white people in general, we're never going to transcend this to the level of what students need.
Yeah. So I think you're right. One of the implications of multiculturalism is to have diversity in all of these places, right? Because if it really is multicultural, that means that now we're open to multiple cultures and empowering those cultures too. So one of the issues is, opening access to representatives of certain cultures, and then helping those representatives of those cultures reach into and work with folks within their own cultures. So I think the outreach, diversity, affirmative action is of a sort. It means a variety of things, by the way. Affirmative action is very complicated, but clearly the multicultural idea fits with that, right? And yet, so let me present a different side of this. This again back to the complications of what is a culture. There are better and worse representatives of given cultures also, or better and worse. Sorry, let me rephrase this. Even within cultures, people understand their own cultures in various ways, right? So that when you start pushing on this multiculturalist stuff, you end up with kind of a relativism exposing itself, where now how deep does it go? So we need represented, I'll stick with my own example, white, yes, but I'm white of Eastern European descent. My family's been here for 3 generations. That may make me slightly different from someone else. So what kind of representatives do we need of what? It gets really complicated. Okay, that's one problem. The other, alternative to is that there probably are some universals that it may not matter which culture you come from. So, 2 + 2 is 4, whether you say it in French, Spanish, or Swahili. There are certain universal principles that the culture may not matter. And yet then hear the multiculturalist response, which is, well, yeah, but if you're able to give examples and articulate it in a way that's sensitive to those diverse cultures, the learning will be better. And there we go. Around and around. And you must have been involved in these conversations.
I know there's no real solution to it. I wanted to say that out loud because I think there's people in here that will be on hiring committees, and I know that I think we're not supposed to take that into consideration. But beyond affirmative action for professors and equal opportunity professors, just in terms of thinking about student success, that to me is one of the key issues, and I feel like it's something that we dance around a lot.
Yeah.
I just think something that is worth thinking about.
Our campus had a very interesting discussion just this last week about Latino student success. So they brought in an external speaker. And the first thing, and it kind of blew my mind, the first thing the speaker said is, there's no such thing as the Latino student. And then he explained, okay, people, it depends on the generations. And then, by the way, there are Mexican students that don't speak any Spanish, right? So that makes things even more complicated.
Yes.
we want to do all this, but then how complicated does it become? And how important is it too? Because given that level of diversity, even within, Latino, if there's that level of diversity, then we got to be that much more sensitive and attentive to the needs of these diverse constituencies. It's cool, and it's difficult.
But we can definitely look at our faculty and say, we're pretty white faculty, and that there's maybe something inherently problematic for students.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Then we look at power. We have diversity in regards to our students. We have diversity as it relates to the population of Nassau County. We have the diversity as it relates to California, but yet we don't have the diversity as it relates to faculty on campus here. It doesn't reflect our environment. And then we talk about the element of power, in terms of power positions as administrators and college professors.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and then there's all kinds of interesting, weird histories about this. And in the philosophy profession, very, very heavily white male. Of all the humanities disciplines, we are notoriously bad. And actually, I'll tell you, this is just confession about philosophy world. There is horrible sexual harassment in our profession that has raised to the level now that it's just embarrassing to be one of us, to be perfectly honest. So in some other disciplines, it's been a little bit more inclusive, and it's gradually creeping its way towards us, but we need a bunch of old people to die.
If you don't call on me now, Andy,
Yes.
I'm going to plead sexual harassment. Okay. call me colonial if you want, but what I see this doing is degenerating into every culture, every Hispanic student is different, every white student is different, every black student is different. We all have different cultures. We all ultimately come down to completely different cultural combinations, and I see this degenerating into complete relativism. And what I've been sitting here wanting to say the whole time is, what the hell about truth? I don't teach my students to be free. I want to teach my students true things, and I really believe in truth. I mean, what if we have a culture that wants to teach their children the world is flat? Do we say, oh, let's be sensitive to that culture? That's, I know, I'm ultra colonial, but that's where I find myself going here.
Yeah.
But we can think that.
No, I mean, this is, you know, if you push on this multicultural stuff, it does end up with relativism, right? So now, but what's very interesting about this is that move to the relativist, like it's microcultures all over the place, actually plays back into the hands of the liberal story, which says that we're that unencumbered, right? Namely that we, each of us even inherits our own culture in our own way, right? So why not then treat us just as individuals instead of as bearers of culture again, right? I mean, it's a very interesting way you can circle back on this somehow, that in the end all we're left with is individuals from the way you put it, and then the individuals then need to confront facts in the world, right? Which is basically the traditional story that we've already had. You can hear the communitarian project, people will claim, and multiculturalism, some aspects, is actually very conservative because it presumes that these cultures are these fixed entities, and it subordinates individuals to the cultures, right? Which I think is kind of one of the worries that you have. And yet, people are born with cultures, and these cultures seem to be real somehow. So how do we manage all of that? It's complicated.
So, how I'm understanding, we have all these individuals, the little point of view. However, like in my classroom, I celebrate the individuality of every student and their thought processes. However, there is that embeddedness of us from the Central Valley, a regional group of people that we share in that embeddedness of the culture. Yes, we're all individuals, but we share this embeddedness. Regardless of our race, our ethnic, our cultural backgrounds, we all share this same area, this region.
Yeah.
And so because we are subject to this region of agriculture and where we're located, we have a commonality regardless of our individual natures. So me being a product of that, I'm one of those Latino, Mexican ethnic people that was raised in the valley that don't know how to speak Spanish. So when I break ground with my students, I'm like, I'm basically your Okie Mexican. Because I'm enculturated in the Oklahomian Dust Bowl folks, as well as I am with the people from San Jose and picking fruit and Kennery.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the embeddedness of the culture.
Yeah. No. And this, I mean, now
But
what
also
you're
have as an individual, because there's not that, you know.
what you're pointing out is that there's culture, and then there's culture, and then there's culture.
Right.
And how do we define it, right? So, I mean, there is, you know, I mean, it's ethnic identity is one thing,
Right.
ethnicity and race, I guess. But if any of you studied the ethnicity and race literature, that's a social construct, which is basically the way that most of us think about this, because those biological DNA depth things are just trivial differences, and then there's hybridity and all kinds of problems. Then there's, so that's, I don't know, ethnic and race. Then there's linguistic, right? Linguistic may be different from regional, right? Regional may be different from state level, because the West Coast is different from the East Coast, and that may be, you know, Americans seem to be different from Canadians, and so on. And then, how about you throw in the fact that people move?
Yes. Yes.
So, you know, if you lived in San Jose and then came here, you're like, this is an alien landscape, you know? And then people get married across borders and work and have multiple allegiances, and it gets really complicated, which is why the multiculturalists say that's the stuff we got to pay attention to. Or the liberal individualists say that's why we have to stop paying attention to all that stuff, because there's no way to define it and flesh it out. Instead, they're just individuals at large in the world with reason. Judy left, but with reason that can grasp universal principles that all people in all cultures can grasp.
Can I say one thing based on what you just said, and that is we often talk about identity and identity politics as if it's one thing, but we've been talking about it really as two distinct things. And I want to point us back to the readings that Nigel Hatton had us read on place when he was talking about the sign and the signifier. And so when I think of identity, I think of two very separate things. I think of my identity, my culture, and how I was created, and I choose. But I also think about how someone else sees me, which is something very different than what is viscerally me, because that is part of the stereotype. It's from outside, so the one is from internal, one is but we use that word as if it was the same thing, and they're not. They're totally different things, and I want us to kind of remember that when we're thinking about this place and how we use that.
Yeah, I mean, it's self-identity, and then how you are identified by others, right? Yeah. Let me quickly go to struggle of recognition, just because it'd be interesting. It may connect to this. Let's go to Hegel on this, because I think it's connected to what you're saying. The existentialists, by the way, this Sartre's famous thing about, he doesn't identify with the way he's being identified by others. And this can be traced back into this history in Hegel. But the story looks something like this. Plato seems to have a hint about this. Hegel clearly suggests that what the social world looks like is that we want other people to recognize us as dignified beings worthy of respect. Okay? And to use this kind of language, we want other people to recognize our identity rather than being forced to recognize their identity or their way of identifying us, right? So Hegel gives this in the Phenomenology of Spirit, and Leonard, you probably know it much better than I because you teach that class. But what happens is ultimately there's a struggle about who's going to give homage or who's going to respect the other person, right? And at some point I'm asking you to recognize me, you're asking me to recognize you, and we're going to fight for it. We're going to fight for it, and then at some point there's a slippage and one person submits and the other person becomes the master. Okay? When you start thinking about this in your own personal life, your marital relations and so on, that's pretty clear that there's something to this. But what happens, unfortunately, is when the one submits to the other, now the recognition is no longer what you were looking for, because the master, who is now recognized by the slave, says, well, that's not worth much, because it's just a slave recognizing me. I wanted to be recognized by someone who's as cool as me, right? Who's as worthy of respect as I am, but now I'm just being recognized by an unworthy slave. And it turns out that the master in this situation is completely dissatisfied. The reverse for the slave, though, who's forced to then really think about things because he's been put under, basically, and he has to kind of reflect. And it turns out that through this process, Hegel suggests that the slave may actually turn out to be better than the master in this strange circumstance. Leave that aside. The solution, social theory after Hegel, especially in the 20th century with Habermas and Appel and some of these other guys, is that what should happen is this top line, is that there should be mutual recognition. So I recognize your identity and your dignity, you recognize my identity and dignity, and there will be no subordination, right? Because as Hegel seems to suggest, every subordination move is ultimately dissatisfactory. Not only is it power and slavery, but neither side gets what they want, right? So it's supposed to be mutual recognition that we're aiming after. Back to the multicultural, if I can conclude with this here somewhere. Okay, so more or less, here's the problem that I think we're kind of left with, and I think we're heading towards the end here anyway, so maybe just leave it with this and you can argue further with me about this. But if that's the nature of social reality, right, if it is struggle for recognition and it always results in some hierarchy and subordination, right, and if we understand the multicultural story that Kimlicka is talking about and the examples that we've talked about, what we're kind of left with is nothing but struggle. Right? As each group vies and as each member of each group vies for supremacy, vies to have their identity recognized, struggles against the identifications that are foisted upon them by the dominant structure and so on, we're left with a social scene that is just bubbling, boiling confusion. And I worry that when we go down this multicultural path, like Kimlicka suggests, that that's kind of what we're left with. It's nothing but struggle. I said this earlier, back to kind of how we talk about the fractious nature of American politics. Isn't that what we're seeing? Right? Where every little subgroup and every personality is struggling to be recognized, in a sense, Facebook and so on, right? I mean, this is a constant self-promotion, putting ourselves out there to be recognized by one another, and it turns out there's no harmony in this. It's just conflict, ongoing tension. I'm not sure there's any resolution here. And back to nation building, right? So Kimlicka talks about one of the projects of modernity is to build unity, right? How do we build unity in a social world that's based on this ongoing and incessant struggle for recognition? Even, notice by the way, according to this analysis, if you were recognized, so my group is now recognized, tomorrow you'll find it dissatisfactory. Because whoever recognized you, well, damn it, that's not what I wanted. I wanted something different from that, right? And then each subgroup fragments. And then Kimlicka talks about this. I don't think it's in this, in the readings here, but there's power plays within these subgroups, and people use the group itself as ways of trying to empower themselves at the expense of the group, and so on. The liberal solution is stop this. Let's stay out of each other's business. Benign neglect, Kimlicka's phrase. Let's try to just leave each other alone, right? Let's ignore the struggles for recognition. It's not important. All we want to make sure is that everyone can kind of bounce along, having their rights not violated, right? Free market capitalism, laissez-faire, just leave people alone. But the Hegelians and the Kimlickas and this kind of view in social philosophy says that's not sufficient, because people are not content to just bounce along, right? Every time you bounce, you want to look eye to eye and be recognized by the other, right? So it's an interesting diagnosis or account of what does social reality look like. Is it about struggles for recognition? Or can we imagine ourselves as these atomic, unencumbered individuals who just bounce blithely along and ignore each other? So I don't know, that's where I ended up with these notes. There's a lot more, there's a lot more to be said.
So are you well, I'm sorry. Are you going to join us for pizza afterwards?
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah, I will.
Continue this discussion maybe a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know in indigenous culture, when we want to, we're working on the process of decolonizing, we go back to a phrase called in la esh, you are my other self, and I am your other self. So there's an element of being mutually, I'm seeing, so whatever I do to you bounces back to me. We're mirrors to each other, rather than the element of domination and subordination. There's an element of sharing power. So
Yeah.
I'm invested in you, and that's how I use my pedagogy. I use indigenous pedagogy in the classroom, is that however I help my student, I'm helping myself, and I'm helping the climate in the classroom, because that student is my other self.
Yeah.
And then that student, oftentimes, especially, seeing, many of my students will acknowledge that I'm a rare Chicana teacher on campus, and will say such, beautiful things in terms of that they see themselves in me. So they see themselves in me, in La Esh, and I see myself in them.
Yeah.
So it's a circle. I actually have a tattoo of it, in terms of the combination.
And it's not about forcing someone to recognize you. So notice this, this story, the Hegel account that Kimlicka picks up in Struggles for Recognition. There's lots of ways to criticize it. And you're making me think of one feminist critique of this, that this is masculinist approach to the world. about struggle and domination and submission, you know. It may be that that diagnosis of social reality is inherently masculinist, leads to war. The reason we're left with conflict, well, the model itself is already set up on conflict.
The story itself is a masculine story.
Yeah. I mean,
We need a female
Yeah.
philosopher to come up and just argue these points and try to run with and have this discussion.
yeah,
Just
yeah.
indigenous. I mean, you know, not all indigenous were patriarchal. You know, you had, you know, there's various, you know, I kind of follow Lakota tradition. And Lakota tradition, I mean, you know, Native Americans are still alive, folks. And, you know, when you're around indigenous circles, we do things very differently. Whereas in the dominant culture would say that is, you know, that's homophobic. The homophobia would come out, or that's feminine. You know, men in ceremony wear skirts. They wear earrings. They nurture, you know, their sons and daughters. It's a very different way. It's, you know, the decolonized way of living before colonization. And it's still alive and well, but we're just trying to survive.
Yeah, and I mean, unfortunately, given the history, trying to survive in a culture that comes with all these kind of paradigms, right?
Exactly.
Which is where I mean, I think if to try to make this sound nice, is that Kim Lick is trying to point towards, well, we need to find ways to celebrate those kind of differences as well. But the paradigm's already set, right? Historically, we've got the liberal, hierarchical struggle for recognition paradigm, and now it's time to recognize some of these alternatives.
And that becomes internalized even within indigenous circles. You see the colonization, even within when I'm sitting around my red brothers and sisters, you see the colonization taking place. It's been internalized.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
cultural diffusion. His perspective there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you said about we need a female philosopher to come in. One of my favorites is Care Ethics and Nell Noddings and some of these folks who, Nell Noddings, her approach to this is to say, I'm just not going to play that game at all. So I'm going to describe the world from the standpoint of a nurturing mother in the world, and here's what it looks like. And the minute you try to universalize it or try to put a structure on it, a set of categories on it, now you're forcing me to play a different game, right? And that game doesn't work for me anymore, from my standpoint. So, and Judy's saying, yeah, but what about truth?
I would say that, so all of this is in the realm of social reality, as opposed to the hard sciences, where this is not as much interesting.
Yeah.
Right? We're teaching chemistry, okay, that's how we teach it. This is what's going, the facts of the matter.
You're
But
being
when you talk about
provocative,
social,
You're being provocative right now?
right, it's time. Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could have a multicultural approach
No, I
to
wasn't being provocative.
even hard sciences, right? That would say, well,
Neurophysiology, I mean,
let's go back to the Hmong spirit catch you and you fall down model. I guess if you're a multiculturalist, you can say that there are different ways to describe what's happening in the experience of someone. And if this culture describes it as spirit departing the body, and a different culture describes it as brain malfunction, right? How are you going to weave those back together again, right? So the multiculturalists may even permit multiple descriptions of singular phenomena. Now Judy's cringing back there, right? Which one is right and which one is wrong? The multicultural approach doesn't want to get to that level of right and wrong. Wants to instead empower groups. Yeah.
I don't know that it's so easy to say what's right or wrong, because even there are sort of clear examples a bit more removed from culture. Like if you look at the symptoms of a heart attack in a man versus a woman, and for a very long time the only thing taught is what happens to a man. And they completely ignored the fact that it functions differently in a woman. So I don't know that it's quite as part of the subject as we
but don't you think we are now getting closer to correct answers? That finding out how much of everything is a function of, I'm sorry, I mean, this is the way I see it, is a function of what your brain is doing, is getting closer to what's truth about us, rather than just saying, well, this is about men and this is about women. It's about.
I think we're getting closer because we were open to those things. If we close it off now and stop being open to other possibilities, we won't continue to get closer.
This is a tricky one, you know, because now our multicultural, you know, spheres includes like monists and dualists, right? I mean, it goes deep into metaphysics, right? How is there brain only, or is there soul too? You know, and from the multicultural standpoint, who's to say?
But,
you know?
But she's absolutely right. I mean, it depends on who has the power. So I guess this is Foucaultian, and that whoever has the power to ask the questions, and then the people who pursued those questions. I mean, you look at the medical history. You look at the Tuskegee studies in the United States, and the effect that had on the black community. You look at sterilization, and 25% of Native American women who of childbearing age were sterilized because they were thought to have too many children in this country. The sciences are made up of people who have their own cultures and ideas and affect the policies that the sciences, including their research and their assumptions and their pronouncements. And so just in the pursuit of these so-called objective types of discipline, and this is why I said, being provocative.
No, I wasn't going to talk.
This is more important because there's this blanket belief that they are immune to these questions or problems, and it's absolutely opposite.
No,
Yeah, I'm not sure if this relativism goes all the way down.
Yeah.
You know, because I think there's always there's all these great historical examples of science done horribly, and yet that doesn't mean that science in general functions that way. And certainly, there's all kinds of ways in which we trust what science brings us, regardless of one's culture. And so suddenly it gets really complicated. So I'm going to get in my car and drive back to have pizza with Andrew. And I think no matter what culture I'm in, it's now the way the meaning around that would be culturally embedded. I'll stop there.
We can continue
So
to
I
talk
think-
about
yeah,
it,
I think
argue
we have
about
it.
it.
You guys just did this, by the way, which is that that's what we're left with. I mean, these are deep questions.